get into today's episode, I want to touch on the general direction of my content moving forward. While I'll certainly still be focused on crypto, I will be weaving in content related to politics, social, economics, and really anything that is going on in the world that really may seem tangential to crypto, but I think we have to start breaking down these barriers as to what we can talk about. I think to really talk about crypto as a change in the way that we conduct not only business, but conduct life, we have to talk about everything. So that's what my content is going to talk about, is a crypto-centric focus on everything so that we can really understand that in the midst of everything going on with this virus, that there is an opportunity for us to really fit these pieces together and realize the opportunity, not just for crypto, but to sort of change the system that we're all stuck in this sort of infinite loop in. So I'm going to start with some general guiding thoughts, and I think I'm going to have every episode moving forward, whether it's just going through it, for a quick 5 minutes, but just something to provide some context for new listeners, and even just to remind you on how I think about things as we move forward. So I'll get into the guiding thoughts. Starting with the dollar is backed by nothing. I've realized over the last several months that a lot of people don't understand that the dollar is fundamentally backed by nothing. Really, all government money is backed by nothing. It's not backed by gold. It's not backed by any precious metal. It's really just, if anything, if you want to say loosely, it's backed by the military and the government being able to sort of enact its will, maybe upon its citizens, or worse yet, probably against other countries. So the dollar is backed by nothing. The money that is printed, the money that is created, all the trillions you've been seeing on the news, it's literally backed by nothing. And really, if anything, it's backed by confidence, but nothing hard. It's not backed by anything that you can necessarily touch. It's backed by the confidence that we all agree to, that the dollar has value, or the euro has value, or any sort of other government fiat currency. So keep that in mind through everything. There's nothing that is backing the US dollar. Cryptocurrency, I hear a lot of guys like Peter Schiff, who I respect a lot. I've learned a lot about him from economics. At the same time, he always says, you can't use crypto for anything. You can't use Bitcoin for everything. I think the cryptocurrency community has not done a good job of explaining the value proposition of crypto outside of a strictly USD price measurement, which is backed by nothing. So you really have to start thinking about, we need to change this narrative. And really, cryptocurrencies are, when Peter Schiff and others, other gold bugs, or sort of no coiners as we would call them, say that crypto or Bitcoin or Ethereum is backed by nothing, or it can't be used for anything. Gold is used for this, silver is used for this. What is crypto used for? And I think crypto actually is used for two things that I think, while aren't necessarily hard, have something that we don't have, provide something that we don't have today in the current fiat monetary system, and that's trust and freedom, right? So with crypto, when you talk about trust and freedom, what does that mean? Well, with crypto, let's take Bitcoin for example, and I'm certainly just using Bitcoin because it's the most recognized coin. You could say this about Monero, you could say this about Ethereum and a lot of different coins. But for instance, you take Bitcoin, what is that trust? Well, that trust is that because the records are duplicated everywhere on the blockchain, you can trust in the network. You don't have to trust in a central entity or a third party, right? So you don't need the concept of a Fed. The nodes, the protocol, the code, that is the trust. So the product of trust is actually, to me, immeasurable. It's something that we can't even really wrap our heads around because it's sort of a loose concept. But if we have a monetary system that's trustless, and trustless is actually not accurate when people say that. When they say that crypto is trustless, it means you don't have to trust someone. You're more so trusting the network, which is made up of millions of people, thousands of nodes that all have copies of that blockchain. So you don't need to trust that central third party. So trust and freedom the freedom to use the network, no permission, no KYC. You can use the network in a way that you want to. You can conduct business with anyone that you want to. And I think when you talked about trust and freedom, I think that cuts across all political spectrums, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Libertarian. Fundamentally, it does not matter. And we have to keep that in the back of our minds. So crypto's real value proposition is not so much any sort of fiat or USD measured value. It's more so the trust and freedom that it's going to provide you. Next, I think, when you talk about crypto as well, we need to start measuring crypto in capability, not price. So what does that mean? Well, the only time anything shows up on CNBC or in the news is when Bitcoin goes to 20,000 or Bitcoin goes to 3,000, or when Ethereum is worth $1,500 or $1,000, or when it crashes down to $10. But ultimately, we're measuring that in a value not backed by anything. What we really need to start doing is measuring crypto in capability. What do I mean by capability? I mean measuring it in what can it do? What sort of economy can you build with crypto that's going to allow you to have trust and freedom? So you can see where I'm going with this. Some networks are more capable than others. For instance, with Bitcoin right now and Ethereum, sort of that base function is to do peer-to-peer transfer of value between two entities. And that's fantastic. But really, to overcome the fiat monetary system, to get that trust and freedom that we really need as a society, we need to think about what else can you do? What complex transactions can you perform? So with things like smart contracts, certain mechanisms of governance, things like oracles, which provide input data, and I'm not going to get too technical here, we need to measure in ways of capability, functions. What can we do with the cryptocurrency, not what the price is? And I know, once again, that's sort of a soft concept, but when you can enable new things to be done and you get your trust and freedom with that, I think that's something, once again, that's just an immense value that we don't really have a way to conceptually put some value on that other than measuring in sort of the common, Bitcoin's worth 10,000. So keep in mind that that's where we need to go. Those are the things you need to think about. Measure crypto in capability, not price. The next guiding thought is tribes and labels will limit you. And what I mean by that is, I think right now there's a lot of divisiveness going on in the world, whether that's in the crypto space or in the political space. We have Democrats, we have Republicans, we have the Green Party, we have libertarians, you have anarchists. I think ultimately, once you sort of prescribe yourself to any specific tribe or label, what you're basically, telling yourself, even if you choose to do that, is that these are sort of the principles that I'm going to go by. But ultimately, when you do that, you're putting a line between yourself and someone else who you probably have much more in common than you can probably think about. That also goes to racial, even racial-based politics. If you're black, you think like this. If you're white, you think like this. If you're Hispanic, you think like this. If you're European, you think like this. If you're Chinese, you think like this. And that's not to say that you shouldn't respect and value your culture or your tribe. It's just to say that really start thinking about what you as an individual want and what sort of opportunities do you have for yourself. And I think the more we can think about sort of understanding and maybe respecting these tribes and labels, I think when you sort of prescribe them to yourself and letting that define you, it limits your openness, not just to opportunities, but also knowledge. The next guiding thought I want to get into is choice is often an illusion. And the reason I say that is because I think we're really in a place right now where we're really between a rock and a hard place. And that's, once again, you're being asked to choose between two terrible presidential candidates. I don't care if you're talking about Biden or you're talking about Trump. These are terrible candidates. End of story. I'm not here to sort of choose the lesser of two evil. Evil is evil. So I think we have to start thinking outside the box, that really when we're given these two choices by a limited media apparatus, which almost, most of the media apparatus is owned by very few people. Choice is an illusion. And we need to start recognizing that, we get a lot of freedom talk about choice and you get to choose this. But once again, if you apply those tribes and labels to yourself, choice becomes an illusion, because ultimately you're sort of between a rock and a hard place. So I don't care if the hard place is Democrat or the hard place is Republican or anything else. We need to step away from those two sort of boundaries that we're put into, and realize that this choice is an illusion, and we just need to step back from that, right? So right now, in the midst of everything that's going on with this virus, everyone's home, we have to keep in mind that everything that we're doing is forcing us to this. We can either be for or against it. We can't really be outside the box. So just keep in mind that choice is often an illusion. Avoid debt culture is the next guiding thought. And this is something I'm going to get into a lot. I think when you look at how this is tied into the monetary system and the culture that, especially in America, that we're essentially sort of brainwashed every day, consumerism, what we're really being sort of driven into and have been in for a while. And I can tell you right now, I've dealt with it myself. I've got friends. I know a lot of people that we get trapped into this life of debt culture, right? We want the fastest car. We want a new house. We want this. We want that. And I think what it does is it puts you back into, it sort of is another tether to this existing system where we're working for a dollar that's backed by nothing. We don't have any trust and freedom within our government. So, and we're put into these tribes and labels. We have prescribed ourselves to these tribal labels that we feel like we choose, but ultimately we don't, because that choice is an illusion. So everything is really all tied together, and we have to start realizing that we have the technology in place today that we can choose our lives, we can have our preferences, and we can live in a way that we don't have to prescribe our values onto other people, right? Crypto is going to do that for us. Why? Because crypto is the first time that we've really been enabled as a community to establish our own network effect and do that in a trustless way that's going to enable our freedom. So we really got to start thinking about that. And these debt mechanisms that are created really just sort of help push us down this sort of fiat, backed by nothing dollar debt culture that we're tethered to. So part of this that I'm going to start talking about is really helping people realize that the things we think we need, driven by consumerism, is just really a trap to keep you tethered to the dollar, right? And I think we got to start cutting across a lot of lines, political lines, economic lines, in crypto, to really understand where we need to go. And then the last guiding thought is, the Fed only causes unnecessary inflation and taxes. And I think this is a sort of core issue going on right now in society, that we really have. A lot of people don't even understand the function of the Federal Reserve. They don't understand the history of the Federal Reserve. And, right now I could talk about other central banks, but fundamentally everything is tethered to the dollar. And the dollar, once again, is backed by nothing. So let's keep that in mind, that really anything the Fed does is going to result in one of two things, usually both ultimately. It creates unnecessary inflation, and later on in this episode I'm going to talk about that. And it also results in you paying additional taxes, which also limit your ability to make free choices for yourself. So let's get into today's content. One of the interesting articles that I saw recently is that someone theorized that Bitcoin will follow Ethereum and move to proof of stake. And I think that's a very, very interesting proposition or scenario to consider. If you look at what Ethereum is doing, it's been talking about going to proof of stake for a very long time. And one of the biggest battles in the crypto space is sort of moving away from the traditional proof of work, which is Bitcoin, sort of obviously the first most respected coin in the space, cryptocurrency in the space. And Ethereum has often, since day one, talked about moving to proof of stake, which uses less power, is not mining driven. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see if that happens. If proof of stake occurs, ultimately, I think that's going to be great for the cryptocurrency space. I've always theorized, and I actually have an old video on it if you want to check it out. Really, fundamentally, there's no difference between proof of stake and proof of work, because if you really, when it comes down to it, if I have $1 billion, okay, if I have $1 billion, and let's say the network, let's say both Bitcoin and Ethereum, or Bitcoin and any proof of stake network, let's look at it from that perspective. If I have a network that is proof of work and proof of stake, and I have $1 billion, let's say they have the same market cap, what have you. If I had $1 billion, I could either buy mining hardware and perform a hash attack to do any sort of nefarious activities on a proof of work network. At the same time, if I had $1 billion, I could take that $1 billion and acquire enough collateral to perform nefarious activities on a proof of stake network. Whether that's, when I say staking as well, that could be via masternodes, that could be via delegated proof of stake, or just your traditional staking, right? So I think the entire narrative that staking favors is, the rich get richer. Well, the rich could get richer in with proof of work as well, right? I think we just haven't tested it out in the wild like we have with proof of work, and I just don't see proof of work lasting over the long term, over the sort of long time horizon. I think right now it has the highest credibility, but I think you'll get some proof of stake mechanisms that get tested out in the wild and prove themselves successful. And it's the entire Bitcoin community, especially the maximalists, has been very, very resistant to making any fundamental changes to the protocol. So I ultimately see this being a sort of immense pivot points for the success of Bitcoin in the future, is if they stick to the block size, if they stick to not changing or not improving the protocol to enable new capabilities. If you remember earlier in my guiding principles, I talked about measuring in crypto and capability, not price. And I think that's very important to do, because really the only way we're going to really be able to change the way that we conduct business and live our lives is if you can perform more and more trustless transactions, trustless complex transactions. And that's going to enable us to experience more freedom. If we can't do that, if we're just, and for instance, Bitcoin never adopts any sort of complex transaction mechanism via smart contract in a native way, I think it's not going to be successful. So I think it's very interesting that someone even proposed this. I see the Bitcoin community being very much against this sort of fundamental change, but ultimately it's going to be very interesting to see how that sort of works out for Bitcoin. I think proof of stake or any variant of staking is going to get tested in a while. I think Ethereum is going to be very successful, and at the same time, Ethereum already supports smart contracts. It already has things like oracles. And I think you're going to be able to build an economy on something like an Ethereum, something like a Tezos, something like a Cosmos, which already have staking, something like an EOS, and already have smart contracts and these other sort of mechanisms that are going to enable a true, more trustless economy than what Bitcoin can provide currently. That's not to say that I think Bitcoin is going to end or going to go away. I think it's going to just have a very, very limited use case in the future. And I don't think that serves well for it over a longer time horizon. The other thing I saw that I thought was worth mentioning in the cryptocurrency space is there's been a lot of layoffs, and that fits into sort of what's going on with the virus, and economically it's going to impact a lot of different businesses. But I saw that BitGo laid off 12%. First thing I'll say is that BitGo is a fantastic company. I think they've really brought the cryptocurrency space forward. On a previous project, I actually worked with some people with BitGo. I've got nothing bad to say about BitGo. At the same time, I think one of the disruptions that cryptocurrency is going to bring is something that's called disintermediation. And essentially that's the removing of a third party. And I think BitGo fit a market gap at the time, especially at an institutional level, is providing custody services. But eventually what you're going to see is that custody is going to be done in a more transparent and disintermediated way, where you don't even need a BitGo at some point. That's not a next year thing. That's not even maybe even a 5-year thing. But I can see a lot of different custody solutions that are out there right now that in their very nascent way, there are some solutions out there that enable you to perform custody via your friends, or self-custody solutions. So keep that in mind. Like I said, I don't mean to say anything bad about BitGo. They're a great company, but I can see entities like even Fidelity, anything that's a custody asset, as this technology evolves, as we get more capabilities once again, I think you're not going to need these sort of third parties to really perform this function at a level that is more aligned with the traditional entities that we have today. So here's something that no one's talking about. I think everybody's talking about the coronavirus, COVID-19. I came across this story, and if you're not following this guy, Peak Prosperity, he's on YouTube, check him out. He does a lot of good reporting. He was onto this is how I got into the virus when he started talking about it in mid-January. He talked about an article that showed that early analysis for coronavirus, COVID-19 specifically, shows that this virus, yes, it attacks the lungs. Yes, it's damaging. And I'll be the first to say I'm not a biological expert, but looking at data, one of the things that this virus does that a lot of other viruses don't do, and when you talk about this being a novel coronavirus, this virus attacks T cells. So what other virus attacks T cells? And I don't say this to be a conspiracy theorist. I know that Zero Hedge at one point talked about this, and then they got banned from Twitter, which don't even get me started on that. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that there is data that's coming out that shows that the coronavirus, the one that we're dealing with today, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, attacks T cells. And that's very similar to the behavior of HIV, right? So how does this fit into everything? Well, this is obviously tied to our economy. How can we go back to normal? What does normal look like moving forward? People talk about vaccines in 18 months. I don't know how that's going to happen. The media is not reporting on this sort of early data, just like they weren't reporting on the coronavirus in mid-January. Whether you want to blame Trump for not acting, or if you want to blame acting soon enough, or you want to blame the WHO for listening to China, or you want to blame China for not being open about it. No one is talking about this data now. And I think my concern is that how are we going to get a vaccine for something that attacks T cells along with the lungs and other organs, if we don't even have an HIV? If someone that is out there that's listening to this can correct me as far as, hey, we know how to perform vaccines for viruses that attack T cells. Essentially, T cells, if you're not aware, are essentially tied to your immune system. So the way you can think about this virus is that it sort of holds you down as it attacks you. And so it's not just an attack that makes you weaker. It goes to attack your immune system while it's attacking you. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle, which is why, and there's data to back this up. So we just keep an eye out for this. I know a lot of people aren't going to hear this now, but I'm sharing, if you're watching a video, a nature.com article. This is real science. This is just real research. Start looking into it. Start looking for this. The next thing I want to talk about is the stimulus bill, which is also tied to the coronavirus. But, at the time, this is probably in mid-March, so a month ago. At the time, there was a stimulus bill. It's $2 trillion. And I became immediately concerned that no one was doing their due diligence on this bill. And honestly, it reminded me of a time that we had back in 2008 when, there was just a lot of chaos going on, and there were a lot of bailouts, and everyone thinks everyone's being helped. But ultimately, everyone isn't being helped, right? So the thing that you want to keep in mind is that here are the facts on the stimulus bill that was passed, the $2 trillion stimulus bill. The first fact is that this stimulus bill that was passed is not really $2 million. It's really 6.25. I mean, it's not $2 trillion. It's $6.25 trillion. Why? Because there was a provision in that bill that essentially enabled $425 billion by large corporations to be leveraged to get loans for another $4.25 trillion. So I'll repeat that again. $425 billion could be leveraged to get $4.25 trillion in loans. And what that enables is this really an extension or another version of the Cantillon effect, because that's no strings attached money, which then, corporations can use that. They may not be able to use it for stock buybacks. I think there was a provision for that, but ultimately it's going to enable them to pay out bonuses to the executive and there's no checks on how they can use that money. Meanwhile, small businesses and Americans all across this nation are going to have to settle for $1,200 checks, and they're already out of the $400 billion that was set aside for, I think it was maybe $350 billion that was set aside for small businesses. So the worst part of this is that despite what you're going to see in the media, I don't care if it's on Fox News, I don't care if it's on MSNBC, CNN, anything, no one's telling you how terrible this bill is. This bill should not, there was only one person in Congress who stood up against this bill and wanted a recorded vote, and Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats didn't want a recorded bill in the House. 96 senators voted for this bill. The vote was 96-0. So there's no pass for Democrats, there's no pass for Republicans. This is what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter who put this content in the bill when you voted for it. That's the issue. We've got to get out of these false choices. Oh, this article says that Senate Republicans put it in. What does it matter who put it in if everybody voted for it? It's ridiculous. Everyone voted for this bill. We have to move away from that. Looking at who put it in. Doesn't matter who put it in. Bernie Sanders voted for it. AOC voted for it. She's claiming she didn't. But just like Thomas Massie, who is a Republican, but I'm not saying because he is a Republican, he was the only one that stood up. They wanted to have a recorded vote. Nancy Pelosi overruled him because she's the Speaker of the House. I don't care how much grandstanding you do, whether you're Bernie Sanders or whomever, or AOC or whomever, you did not vote or force a recorded vote on this bill. They grandstanded about maybe what they didn't like in the bill, but ultimately they voted for it. And that's the disappointing thing. We have no real leadership in Congress that's going to do the right thing for people. They're just going to continue voting for bills that continue the debt culture, that continue this sort of trap that Americans are put in. And all this does is ultimately reduce your freedom and your ability to choose, to truly choose. This two-party system is a complete mess. So what else was in this bill that was terrible? Well, here's another story. Fed's high yield ETF buying defies explanation. Well, what's going on here? Well, the Fed is starting to buy ETFs. Well, that's not even the real sort of crux of this. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, BlackRock, which is a very large financial institution, the Fed brought on BlackRock to help it figure out what bonds to buy. So, as I said earlier, the Fed is responsible for spending money, creating money. Okay? Well, I'll take that back. They're not responsible for spending money, but now they are being responsible for it. That's not part of their sort of edict, but they're doing it now. The Fed hired BlackRock to tell it what bonds to buy. what assets to buy in the stock market, what securities to buy. Well, guess what? BlackRock turned around and did. BlackRock said, buy our ETFs. And that's what we're getting now. We're getting BlackRock working with the Fed to buy back their failed assets to the tune of billions, if not trillions of dollars. Don't believe me? I'll put this article. These are from credible sources, Bloomberg. Fed bought high yield ETFs, BlackRock's, here it is, BlackRock Inc.'s $15.8 billion high yield bond ETF. That's just one example. Do you hear any Democrats talking about this? Do you hear any Republicans talking about this? No. This is one of the largest heists that are going on right now. And no one's talking about it. Yeah, there's a Bloomberg article, but if you turn it on CNN, if you turn it on Fox News, if you turn it on MSNBC, not even any what you would consider progressive channels really talk about this. This is what's going on in this country. To the tune of billions and trillions of dollars, you have the Fed working with other large financial institutions, bailing them out one way or another. And I think that's a travesty. That invites an inflation and or tax on the common person who's not getting the benefit of that. Here's another bad thing that was in the bill, this stimulus bill. A lot of you may not be aware, but there is something called the Sunshine Act. And it was created in 1976 to add openness and transparency to the activities of the Federal Reserve. Well, guess what? In the stimulus bill, there was a provision that basically said the Fed could distribute trillions of dollars without meeting the requirements of the government in the Sunshine Act. So what does that mean? That means we just lost our transparency. So they can have their secret meetings and they can have their decisions. None of it needs to be documented. You're talking about billions to trillions of dollars being enabled, being distributed to these companies, and we don't have any record of it. All it does is create plausible deniability. Once again, there is no Republican, there is no Democrat. Trump's not talking about it. Biden's not talking about it. Bernie Sanders is not talking about it. This is a heist, and you're in the middle of it. And you're certainly not going to get the media talking about it. Once again, let's go back to our guiding principles. The dollar is backed by nothing. There's no trust, and there's no freedom in what we're dealing with when it comes to this. And that's something that crypto is going to deliver or enables us to do. But we got to start thinking about it in a way of what can we do with it versus just the value of it in USD. I mean, in fiat. Bitcoin's $10,000. Who cares? What does Bitcoin enable you to do? What does Ethereum enable you to do? What privacy options does Monero give you? Or what smart contracts are on Ethereum that enable private transactions? These are the things you got to start asking yourself. Why? Well, let's look at the money supply. The money supply has skyrocketed over the last 40 plus years. Well, how does that impact you? Well, the money supply, I think in about 1980 was around, as you see here, $2 billion. Actually, it was less than that. 1980, it was my mistake. It was $1.5 trillion in 1980. The M2 money supply today is close to $17 trillion. So let me repeat that again. 1.5 trillion in 1980, and then almost 17 trillion already today in 2020. So you're talking about 40 years. 40 years. We've had an increase of, I think, somewhere around, if I'm doing that math, around 1,100%. Yes, 1,100% increase in money supply. It's even worse if you look at the near-term aspect of it. Let's look at the last 10 years. It's gone from, say, 8.5 trillion to almost 17 trillion today in 10 years. So let's see, the money supply has doubled because the dollar's backed by nothing. Has your buying power doubled? Has your salary doubled? Has your cost of living gone in half? Has it gone the other way? No. This is what you should be upset about. Once again, are Democrats saying anything? Are Republicans saying anything? No. Is the media saying anything? No. This is what you have to start asking yourself about. What can we do today with the technology and tools we have to change the way and the choices we make to get out of this system where you have a select few who can print money, create money, unbacked money out of thin air, reduce your buying power overnight? Let's look at the last year. The last year, we've gone from 14.5 trillion to almost 17 trillion in the last year. That directly impacts the buying power of the dollars that you use every day. And I'm going to spend more episodes in the future getting into the details of that. I'm going to talk about gold. I'm going to talk about crypto. But just understand, and listen, this is straight off the Fed site where they track the M2 money supply. And you see what we're dealing with. Nobody's talking about this other than on YouTube. There's a lot of people that sort of talk about these things, but they talk about them in sort of buckets. And I'm going to start putting them all in the same bucket. That people are afraid to talk about politics. I'm going to talk about politics. I'm going to talk about the economy. We got to start taking these masks off. Nobody's telling you about anything that's going on out there. So one thing that I'm going to start having on my each episode, I'm going to have something called a segment called Puppets of Power. And I think we got to start realizing the different layers of power and influence that are out there. And, I think that the more we can recognize how we're being influenced and the information, not so much that we're being told, but also the information that we're not being told about. So today's puppet of power is Bakari Sellers. He's a CNN news anchor or reporter, what have you. And he's been spending a lot of his time, as you can see, talking about, shaming minorities, specifically black people. If you don't know who Bakari Sellers is, he's a African American individual. I will say that I am African American or half. I don't think it matters, but I'm just saying that my father was Liberian, my mother is Ukrainian. I'm a U.S. citizen. I've grown up my entire life in the United States. I do love this country, and I appreciate everything all the opportunity that I've had in this country. I've been here for 34 of the 39 years. And I think that you have individuals like this who keep in mind that anyone you see on CNN, anyone you see on Fox News, anyone that you see on MSNBC, more than likely these are millionaires. And they got there because they're willing to keep the narrative that keeps us spinning between these false choices that we have, between Democrat and Republican, between Trump and Biden. So, when I talk about a puppet of power, it's someone that sort of, whether they realize it or not, whether they're a useful idiot or not, but whether they're doing it intentionally or not, are really sort of a tool of those in power, the tool of those that keep us in this sort of debt culture that, where we're using this money backed by nothing and keeping us choosing between two false choices. And anytime you step out of that narrative, they get upset with you. So, Bakari Sellers considers himself sort of one of the authorities on speaking for black people, and I can tell you that he certainly does not, and I certainly don't. He spends a lot of his time going back and forth shaming other African Americans or other minorities for not wanting to support Joe Biden, someone who said they stand for no fundamental change, shaming people who want to consider another option other than Donald Trump or Joe Biden, because they think that we've got to get back to normal. And they call people who are, don't support Joe Biden privileged. You're privileged. No, you're privileged. Your back to normal is a situation that people were already suffering. The world wasn't perfect when Obama was president, or Bush or Clinton. We've been on a steady decline. I don't care what Trump tells you on TV or on his tweets. This economy was not strong. It was not fundamentally strong. No one who's paying attention will tell you that. But instead, you have guys like Bakari Sellers who want to get on TV, and because he's black, he thinks he can speak for the black community and prop up other sort of do-nothing politicians like Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, and, shame people who have independent thought. He went on this whole tirade because Joe Rogan said he liked Bernie Sanders, or Joe Rogan said, I think he said he'd prefer Trump over Biden because Biden doesn't seem to be coherent or might be in an early stage of dementia. Once again, think about that false choice, the illusion of choice. They're forcing us to choose between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. What is that? Those are not choices. We've got to really rethink fear-based voting. When I say fear-based, we vote out of fear. Whether you're a minority voting because you think Donald Trump is a racist, or you think his supporters are all racist, or you're voting for Donald Trump because you feel that someone's going to replace you, or you feel that the government's coming to take your guns. We're not, the media apparatus and the private political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, they've all conditioned us to vote out of fear. And we've got to really, really step back from that and consider better options for ourselves. We have to do that. So I want everyone to think about that moving forward. Think about the information you're being told. Think about what you see every day. And think about how our monetary system has failed us. Our political system has failed us. And all that said, in the midst of this health crisis, we have the opportunity with something like cryptocurrency. As a community, whether it's one community or segmented communities, we can choose Bitcoin, we can choose Ethereum, and the capabilities, not just the investment price, but the capabilities that the cryptocurrencies are going to enable, they're going to give us better options. And that's something we should be very excited about. We should start talking to each other about, because we ultimately don't need the Fed. We ultimately don't need the media apparatus to tell us who. We have that option to trustlessly transact with each other, and the capabilities there are going to continue to grow. And that's going to allow us to have sort of that ability to, have this new freedom that we didn't even know existed, to operate in a more fair system. That's how we have to start looking at things. So, I'm really going to make sure, and I'm sorry if this episode was choppy. Bear with me. I'm going to continue producing content because I think it's very, very critical that we moving forward start really asking about, understanding our reality. All right. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope you look forward to more.